Nobody would believe what happened to me in those woods. Even now, months later, sitting in my apartment in Duluth with the heater running and the city lights streaming through my windows, I can barely convince myself it was real. But every morning when I wake up, I feel the weight of those ancient eyes still watching me, and I know that what I experienced changed me forever. My name is Michael Thompson, and I'm 32 years old. Up until last winter, I was just another burned-out software developer who decided that civilization had nothing left to offer him. I'd spent years staring at screens, debugging code, sitting in meetings that could have been emails, watching my life slip away one fluorescent-lit day at a time. The breakup with Sarah had been the final straw. She'd told me I was becoming a ghost of myself, and she was right. I was disappearing, becoming less human with each passing day. That's why I decided to disappear completely. I found a small cabin for rent about 60 miles northeast of Duluth, deep in the Superior National Forest. The owner was an elderly man named Harold, who'd inherited it from his grandfather and rarely used it anymore. He was happy to rent it out for the winter months to someone who could keep an eye on the place. The cabin was basic, one room with a wood-burning stove, a small kitchen area, and a loft where I could sleep. No electricity, no internet, no cell service, just me, the forest, and silence. I moved there in early November, right before the first real snowfall. I'd stocked up on canned goods, dried beans, rice, and other supplies that would last me through the winter. I had a hand-crank radio for emergencies and enough firewood to last until spring. My plan was simple: spend the winter learning to be alone with myself, to remember who I was before the world had worn me down to nothing. The first few weeks were exactly what I'd hoped for. I'd wake up before dawn, build up the fire, make coffee in an old percolator, and sit on the small porch watching the sun come up through the pine trees. The silence was profound, not empty but full of subtle sounds I'd forgotten existed. The whisper of wind through needles, the distant call of ravens, the crack of branches settling in the cold. I spent my days chopping wood, maintaining the cabin, and taking long walks through the forest. I wasn't completely isolated. There was a small town called Ely, about 20 miles south, and I'd drive down once a week for supplies and to use the payphone to call my sister and let her know I was still alive. The locals were friendly, but respected my desire for solitude. They understood that some people needed to disappear for a while. The forest itself was magnificent. Ancient pines towered overhead, their branches heavy with snow. Frozen lakes stretched like mirrors between the trees. I'd often see deer tracks in the snow, and occasionally the animals themselves, graceful and alert, watching me from a distance before melting back into the trees. There were other tracks too, wolf, lynx, black bear, that were probably already hibernating by then. I felt like I was living in a world that existed long before humans arrived and would continue long after we were gone. It was during my third week there that I first noticed something was watching me. I was splitting wood behind the cabin one afternoon when I felt it, that peculiar sensation of being observed. You know the feeling, the way the hair on your arms stands up when someone's staring at you from across a room. I looked up from my work and scanned the tree line, but saw nothing unusual, just the dark spaces between the pine trunks, shadows that could hide anything. I shrugged it off and went back to my chopping, but the feeling persisted. Day after day, I'd be going about my routine, hauling water from the nearby stream, tending the fire, reading by lamplight, and I'd feel those eyes on me. I started paying closer attention to my surroundings, looking for any sign of what might be watching. I found tracks in the snow around the cabin, but they were strange. Too large to be human, but not quite like any animal tracks I recognized either. They were vaguely humanoid but elongated, with what looked like claw marks at the tips of each toe. I told myself it was probably just a large wolf, or maybe a black bear that hadn't gone into hibernation yet. The isolation was getting to me, making me paranoid. I'd read about cabin fever, How the mind could play tricks when deprived of human contact for too long. I decided to ignore the feeling and focus on why I'd come here in the first place. But ignoring it became impossible when I started seeing movement in my peripheral vision. It was always at the edge of the tree line, just within my sight, but far enough away that I could never get a clear look. A shifting of shadows that seemed too purposeful to be wind moving through branches. When I'd turn my head to look directly, there would be nothing there, just the dark spaces between the trees. But I began to notice that certain trees at the forest's edge seemed different somehow, taller, more gnarled, with an unnatural stillness about them. I started keeping a journal, noting when I felt watched and where I thought I'd seen movement. The pattern that emerged was unsettling. Whatever was out there was observing me almost constantly, but particularly during my daily routines. When I split wood, when I hauled water, when I sat on the porch in the early morning with my coffee, it was learning my schedule, my habits. The thought should have terrified me, but strangely it didn't. There was something patient about the presence, something ancient and deliberate. It didn't feel malevolent exactly, just intensely curious, like it was trying to understand what I was doing in its domain. December arrived with a vengeance. The snow deepened until it reached my waist in places, and the cold became a living thing that seemed to seep through the cabin walls, despite my best efforts to keep it out. I had to be more careful about conserving firewood and making sure I didn't get caught outside in the evening when the temperature dropped to dangerous levels. It was during one of these bitter cold nights that I finally saw it clearly. I'd woken up around 3 in the morning to tend the fire, which had burned down to barely glowing embers. As I was feeding fresh logs into the stove, I heard something that made me freeze, a sound like breathing, but too deep and slow to be human. I quietly moved to the window and peered out into the moonlit snow. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood something that defied every rational thought I'd ever had. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 9 feet from what I could see. Its body was gaunt, almost skeletal, but covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. Its limbs were too long, its fingers extending into sharp points that caught the moonlight like knives. But it was the eyes that truly shook me. Ancient, intelligent, and fixed directly on the cabin window where I stood. We stared at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't even think clearly. This creature was something that shouldn't exist, something from the oldest nightmares of the human mind. But there it was, real and present, and watching me with an intelligence that was both alien and strangely familiar. Then, slowly, deliberately, it raised one of those long-fingered hands and touched the trunk of the pine tree it stood beside. The gesture was almost gentle, like it was drawing my attention to something. Then it melted back into the shadows between the trees, moving with a fluidity that seemed to defy the laws of physics. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat by the window, staring out at the tree line, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was a hallucination brought on by isolation and cold. But deep down, I knew better. Whatever I'd seen was real, and it had been the source of that watching presence I'd felt for weeks. The next morning, I found massive tracks in the snow leading from the tree line to the exact spot where I'd seen the creature, then back into the forest. The tracks were unlike anything I'd ever seen, elongated, with clear claw marks, and so deep they suggested something far heavier than any normal animal. I followed them for a few yards into the woods before my nerve failed me. The tracks led deeper into the forest, toward areas I'd never explored. I should have packed up and left right then. Every rational part of my brain was screaming at me to get in my truck and drive back to civilization as fast as possible. But something held me there. Maybe it was stubbornness, maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the realization that this creature could have harmed me at any time over the past weeks. but hadn't. It had simply watched, observed, waited. Over the following days, I found myself changing my routine in small ways. Instead of staying inside when I felt the presence watching, I would sit on the porch and look directly toward the tree line. I couldn't see the creature, but I could sense it there, patient and still. I started speaking aloud during these times, not really to the creature, but to myself, describing what I was doing and why I was there. "I'm just trying to find some peace," I remember saying one afternoon as I sat with a cup of tea, my breath visible in the cold air. "I'm not here to hurt anything or anyone. I just needed to get away from everything for a while." I felt foolish, talking to what might be empty forest, but something about the act felt important, like I was establishing a dialogue, even if I was the only one speaking. The creature. I'd started thinking of it as that rather than by the name that had been circulating in my mind. The name that carried too much weight and fear began showing itself more frequently, always at a distance, always motionless, always watching. But there was something different about its posture now, something less threatening and more curious. I started leaving small offerings at the edge of the clearing. Not food. I wasn't sure what something like that would eat, and I didn't want to encourage it to come closer. Instead, I left things that seemed meaningful: a carved piece of wood, some smooth stones I'd found by the stream, a few pine cones arranged in a pattern. Each morning, I'd find that these items had been moved or rearranged, always in ways that seemed deliberate rather than random. Christmas came and went without fanfare. I'd brought a small bottle of whiskey with me, and I toasted the holiday alone in my cabin, feeling more at peace than I had in years, despite the impossible situation I found myself in. Or maybe because of it. The presence in the forest had become oddly comforting. I was never truly alone, never completely isolated. Something was sharing this space with me, something ancient and unknowable but not hostile. It was in early January that everything changed. I woke up one morning to a world transformed by the worst blizzard I'd ever experienced. The wind was howling like a living thing, and snow was falling so heavily I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the cabin windows. The temperature had dropped to what felt like dangerous levels, and I could hear trees cracking and falling in the distance under the weight of the storm. By afternoon, it was clear this wasn't just a bad storm, it was potentially life-threatening. The wind was so strong it was causing the cabin to shake, and I could see snow beginning to drift against the walls. My supply of firewood, which I'd thought would be adequate, was depleting faster than expected as I struggled to keep the cabin warm against the howling cold outside. As evening approached, I realized I was in serious trouble. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and I was running out of wood. I'd have to venture outside to get more from the woodpile, which was only about 30 feet from the cabin door, but might as well have been 30 miles in these conditions. I bundled up in every piece of clothing I had and prepared to make the trip outside. The moment I opened the cabin door, the wind hit me like a physical blow, driving snow into my face so hard it felt like needles. I could barely see the woodpile through the whirling white, and each step through the deep snow was a struggle. I managed to gather an armload of logs, but on the way back to the cabin, disaster struck. My foot caught on something buried in the snow, a fallen branch maybe, and I went down hard. The wood scattered around me, and when I tried to get up, pain shot through my ankle. I'd twisted it badly, possibly broken it. Lying there in the snow with the wind howling around me and my ankle throbbing, I realized I might die out there. The cold was already starting to seep through my clothes, and I couldn't put weight on my injured foot. The cabin might as well have been on another planet. That's when I saw movement through the swirling snow. At first, I thought it was just the storm playing tricks on my eyes. But then the shape became clearer, moving toward me with purpose despite the blizzard conditions. It was the creature, larger and more imposing than ever, but moving with surprising grace through the deep snow. I should have been terrified. Here I was, injured and helpless, while something that had haunted my nightmares approached through the storm. But as it drew closer, I felt something unexpected, relief. Not just because help was coming, but because in that moment I understood that this being wasn't my enemy. It never had been. The creature stopped beside me, and I got my first clear look at its face. It was indeed gaunt and otherworldly, with features that seemed carved from shadow and bone. But its eyes, those ancient, intelligent eyes, held something I hadn't expected to see: concern. Without a word, I wasn't even sure it was capable of human speech. It reached down and lifted me from the snow. Its arms were incredibly strong, and despite its skeletal appearance, it carried me easily. Its body radiated a warmth I hadn't expected, and its fur, which had looked matted and rough from a distance, was actually quite thick and soft. It carried me back to the cabin and gently set me down by the door. Then, while I watched in amazement, it began gathering the scattered firewood from around the area where I'd fallen. Its movements were efficient and purposeful, and within minutes it had collected not just the logs I'd dropped, but several more from the woodpile. It stacked the wood neatly by the cabin door, then turned to look at me again. For a long moment we stared at each other through the driving snow. I wanted to say something, to thank it somehow, but words seemed inadequate. Instead, I simply nodded, hoping it would understand my gratitude. The creature nodded back, a surprisingly human gesture from something so alien, and then melted back into the storm as silently as it had appeared. I managed to drag myself inside and tend to my ankle, which turned out to be badly sprained but not broken. But as I sat by the fire that night, burning wood that the creature had gathered for me, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. This being, which every instinct told me should be feared, had saved my life. It had shown kindness to a stranger in its territory, compassion towards something smaller and weaker than itself. The storm raged for 3 more days, but I was warm and safe thanks to the creature's intervention. During the worst of it, when the wind was howling so loudly I couldn't hear my own thoughts, I would sometimes see a dark shape moving past the windows. It was still watching over me, making sure I was safe. When the storm finally broke, I found a new arrangement of objects at the edge of the clearing. The stones and pieces of wood I'd been leaving as offerings had been joined by things from the forest. Unusual pine cones, a piece of bark with an interesting pattern, some berries that had somehow survived the winter. It was like a conversation conducted through objects, a way of communicating that transcended language. Over the remaining weeks of winter, this exchange continued and evolved. I would leave small gifts, and they would be answered with offerings from the forest. Sometimes I would find tracks leading to interesting places, a hidden grove where deer gathered, a frozen waterfall that was particularly beautiful, a cave where I could shelter if caught in bad weather. The creature was sharing its knowledge of the forest with me, teaching me about the land it clearly knew intimately. I began to understand that this being wasn't just an inhabitant of the forest, it was connected to it in ways I couldn't fully comprehend. It knew the location of every stream, every game trail, every safe place to take shelter. It understood the rhythms of the seasons, the patterns of animal migration, the subtle signs that predicted weather changes. It was part of the ecosystem in a way that humans had forgotten how to be. Sometimes, in the early morning hours when the world was still and quiet, I would see it standing at the edge of the clearing, not watching me specifically, but observing the forest as a whole. It would stand motionless for hours, seemingly listening to something I couldn't hear, sensing changes in the environment that were invisible to me. During these times, its presence felt less alien and more like a natural part of the landscape, as integral to the forest as the trees themselves. I started to think of it not as a creature at all, but as a guardian, something that had taken responsibility for maintaining the balance of this place. ensuring that nothing disrupted the ancient cycles that kept the ecosystem healthy. My presence here was unusual, something that needed to be evaluated and understood. But over time, it had determined that I wasn't a threat to what it protected. February brought warmer days and the first hints that winter was beginning to loosen its grip. The snow started to soften, and I could hear the sound of running water as streams began to flow again under the ice. It was during this time of transition that I had my most profound interaction with the guardian of the forest. I was sitting on the porch one afternoon, enjoying the relative warmth of the sun on my face, when I heard footsteps approaching through the snow. Not the silent approach I'd grown accustomed to, but deliberate, audible steps that announced the creature's presence. I looked up to see it standing at the edge of the clearing, closer than it had ever come before. We regarded each other in silence for several minutes, and then, to my amazement, it began to move closer. Step by careful step, it approached the cabin, until it was standing just a few feet away from the porch. Up close, I could see details that had been hidden by distance and shadow. Its fur was a deep brown black, thick and lustrous. Its face, while gaunt and angular, had a nobility to it that spoke of intelligence and age beyond measure. Its eyes were the most remarkable feature, dark and deep, with an awareness that seemed to encompass far more than the present moment. We sat there together in comfortable silence as the afternoon wore on. Sometimes it would shift position or tilt its head, as if listening to sounds I couldn't detect, but mostly it simply observed the forest around us. I found its presence incredibly peaceful. There was something about its stillness, its complete comfort with silence, that made me feel more centered than I had in years. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered trees in shades of orange and gold, the creature stood and looked at me directly. For a moment I thought it might try to communicate somehow, but instead it simply nodded again, that strangely human gesture, and began to walk back toward the tree line. But before it disappeared into the shadows, it stopped and looked back at me one more time. In that look, I sensed something like farewell. Not goodbye forever, but an acknowledgement that our time together in this particular way was coming to an end. Spring arrived earlier than expected that year. By mid-March, the snow was melting rapidly, and I could hear the sounds of birds returning from their winter journeys. The forest was coming alive again, after months of dormancy, and I knew it was time for me to rejoin the world I'd left behind. Harold stopped by one day to check on the cabin and was surprised to find me in such good condition after a winter alone in the woods. I was healthier than I'd been in years, both physically and mentally. The isolation hadn't broken me down. It had built me back up in ways I was still trying to understand. "You look different," he said, as we sat on the porch drinking coffee. "Like you found what you were looking for out here." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. Had I found what I was looking for? I'd come to the forest to escape from civilization, to remember who I was beneath all the layers of modern life. What I'd found instead was a connection to something far older and deeper than I'd ever imagined possible. The guardian of the forest didn't appear during Harold's visit, but I could sense its presence in the woods nearby. It was still watching, still protecting, still maintaining the delicate balance that kept this place whole. When it came time to pack up and leave, I felt a profound sadness, not just because I was leaving a place that had become home, but because I was leaving behind a relationship that had changed my understanding of what was possible in this world. I'd been accepted by something that had no reason to trust humans, something that could have seen me as a threat, but chose instead to see me as a temporary member of its community. I left my final offering at the edge of the clearing, a small wooden figure I'd carved during the long winter evenings, depicting a human and the creature sitting together in peaceful coexistence. When I came back the next morning to check, the figure was gone, but in its place were 3 perfect pine cones arranged in a triangle. I took that as a sign of acceptance, of blessing for my journey back to the world of humans. Driving away from the cabin was one of the hardest things I've ever done. I kept looking in my rearview mirror, hoping for one last glimpse of the Guardian, but the forest kept its secrets. As the trees closed behind me and I rejoined the highway that would take me back to Duluth, I felt like I was crossing between 2 different worlds. The transition back to civilization was difficult in ways I hadn't anticipated. The noise of the city, which I'd once found comforting, now seemed harsh and overwhelming. The constant rush of people and traffic felt chaotic after months of forest silence. Simple things like electric lights and internet access seemed both miraculous and somehow wrong, like intrusions into a natural order I'd grown to appreciate. But I wasn't the same person who had fled to the woods the previous November. The experience had changed me in fundamental ways. I found myself more patient, more observant, more aware of the natural world that existed even within the city limits. I started volunteering with local environmental groups, helping to maintain urban wilderness areas and educating people about the importance of preserving wild spaces. I also found myself more comfortable with solitude, but not in the desperate way I'd felt before. The time in the forest had taught me the difference between loneliness and solitude, between isolation and peace. I no longer felt like I was running away from something. Instead, I felt like I was moving toward a better understanding of my place in the world. Sometimes, on quiet nights, when the city finally settles into something approaching silence, I think about the guardian of the forest. I wonder if it still walks among those ancient pines, still maintains its watch over that sacred place. I like to imagine that it remembers our time together, that our brief friendship meant something to a being that has probably watched countless human lives flicker and fade over the centuries. I've thought about returning to the forest, but something tells me that would be a mistake. Our time together was perfect as it was, complete and whole. To try to recreate it would diminish what we shared. Instead, I carry the memory of that winter with me like a talisman, a reminder that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than most people ever dare to imagine. There are moments when I catch sight of movement in my peripheral vision, or when I feel watched while walking through one of Duluth's many parks, and I wonder if perhaps I'm not the only person who has had such an encounter. Maybe there are others like the Guardian, living quietly at the edges of human awareness, maintaining the balance between civilization and wilderness. Maybe the world is full of such beings, and we're simply too busy and too distracted to notice them. Or maybe what happened to me was unique, a once-in-a-lifetime convergence of circumstances that allowed 2 very different forms of consciousness to recognize each other across the vast divide of species and understanding. I'll probably never know for certain, and I think I prefer it that way. Some mysteries are too important to solve. What I do know is that those months in the forest taught me something essential about the interconnectedness of all living things. The Guardian wasn't separate from its environment, it was part of it, woven into the fabric of forest life in ways that made it both protector and protected. In caring for me, it was caring for the ecosystem as a whole, maintaining the harmony that allowed everything to flourish. I try to live that understanding now in my daily life. I'm more conscious of my impact on the environment, more aware of the delicate balance that sustains all life on this planet. I've started growing my own food, composting organic waste, reducing my consumption of unnecessary things. Small gestures, perhaps, but meaningful ones that connect me to the larger web of existence. I've also become something of an advocate for wilderness preservation. I speak at local environmental groups about the importance of maintaining wild spaces, not just for their recreational value, but for their intrinsic worth as habitats for beings we may never fully understand. I don't tell the full story of my winter encounter. I don't think most people would believe it, and I'm not sure it would serve any purpose to share it. Instead, I focus on the verifiable truths that old-growth forests are ecosystems of incredible complexity, that they support forms of life we're only beginning to discover, that once destroyed, they can't be easily replaced. Sometimes I receive emails from people who have heard me speak, people who have had their own encounters with things that shouldn't exist according to mainstream understanding. They write carefully, tentatively, testing whether I might be someone who would believe their stories. I always write back, encouraging them to trust their experiences while being mindful of their own safety and well-being. The world needs people who remain open to possibilities beyond the conventional, who can serve as bridges between the known and unknown. As I write this now, almost a year after leaving the forest, I can feel spring approaching once again. The days are getting longer, the air is warming, and I find myself thinking more and more about those ancient pines and the guardian that watches over them. I won't return. I've made my peace with that decision, but I carry a part of that place with me always. Sometimes I dream about the forest, about sitting on the cabin porch in the early morning with steam rising from my coffee cup while shadows move between the trees. In these dreams, the guardian and I communicate without words, sharing an understanding that transcends language. When I wake from such dreams, I feel refreshed in a way that goes beyond simple rest. I feel connected to something larger than myself, something that extends backward through time to the very beginning of consciousness on this planet. People sometimes ask me what I learned during my winter in the woods, what wisdom I gained from my retreat from civilization. The honest answer is that I learned to listen, not just with my ears, but with my entire being. I learned to pay attention to the subtle signs and signals that most of us miss in our hurried daily lives. I learned that intelligence and consciousness come in many forms, and that our human perspective, while valid, is just one of countless ways of experiencing and understanding existence. Most importantly, I learned that we are not separate from nature. We are part of it, participants in an ancient dialogue between all living things. The guardian of the forest showed me that by accepting my presence in its domain, by caring for me when I was vulnerable, by sharing its knowledge of the natural world, it treated me as kin, despite our obvious differences, because it understood something I was only beginning to grasp, that we all share the same fundamental struggle to survive, to find meaning, to protect what we love. That understanding has become the foundation of how I try to live now. I approach other people with more patience and compassion, recognizing that we're all just trying to make our way through a complex and often challenging world. I approach the natural world with more respect and humility, understanding that I am a guest in ecosystems that existed long before humans appeared, and that will hopefully continue long after we're gone. The memory of those weeks when the guardian watched over me, protected me, taught me, remains one of the most precious things I carry. It's a reminder that kindness and connection are possible even between beings who seem to have nothing in common, that understanding can transcend the boundaries of species and language and conventional reality. In my apartment now, I keep a small altar of sorts on my windowsill, pine cones and interesting stones, pieces of weathered wood. A few pressed leaves from that last autumn before the snow fell. They're reminders of my time in the forest, but also of the ongoing relationship I maintain with the natural world. Each morning I spend a few minutes looking at these objects and remembering what they represent, the possibility of wonder, the reality of connection, the importance of remaining open to experiences that challenge everything we think we know about how the world works. I've started writing more seriously about environmental issues, contributing articles to magazines and websites about the importance of wilderness conservation. I never mention my personal encounter directly, but I write with the passion of someone who has experienced firsthand the intelligence and dignity of the natural world. My words carry more weight now because they come from direct experience rather than abstract knowledge. The transformation I underwent during those winter months wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, like the slow melting of snow in spring. But it was complete. I returned to human society as someone fundamentally different from the person who had fled to the forest in November. I was calmer, more centered, more aware of the interconnections that bind all living things together. I think the Guardian knew this would happen. I think that's why it chose to reveal itself to me, to share its world with a lost human who needed to remember his place in the larger community of life. It saw potential in me for growth and understanding, and it nurtured that potential with the patience of a being that thinks in terms of seasons and cycles rather than days and weeks. The gift it gave me wasn't just protection during a dangerous storm or knowledge about surviving in the wilderness. It was perspective, a way of seeing the world that allows for mystery, for forms of intelligence and consciousness beyond human understanding, for relationships based on mutual respect rather than dominance or exploitation. That perspective has enriched every aspect of my life since returning to civilization. My work has more meaning because I understand it as part of a larger effort to create sustainable ways of living that honor both human needs and ecological balance. My relationships with other people are deeper because I approach them with the same openness and patience the Guardian showed me. Even simple activities like walking through a park or tending to houseplants have taken on new significance as opportunities to participate in the ongoing dialogue between human and natural consciousness. As I prepare to finish writing this account, I find myself thinking about the people who will read it. Some will dismiss it as fantasy or delusion, the product of isolation and wishful thinking. Others might recognize something in it that resonates with their own experiences of the unexpected, their own encounters with forms of intelligence that exist at the margins of accepted reality. For those readers, I want to say this: trust your experiences. Trust the moments when you feel watched by benevolent eyes, when you sense intelligence in places where science says it shouldn't exist, when you feel connected to something larger and older than human civilization. The world is stranger and more wonderful than any of us can fully comprehend, and there is room in it for forms of consciousness we haven't yet learned to recognize or understand. The Guardian of the Forest taught me that wisdom often comes from the most unexpected sources, that protection and kindness can appear in forms we never imagined, that the boundaries between self and other, human and nature, known and unknown, are far more fluid than we typically believe. I carry that wisdom with me now as I navigate the complexities of modern life, and I try to embody the same patience and compassion the Guardian showed to a confused and lost human who stumbled into its territory. In doing so, I hope to honor the gift it gave me, and perhaps pass along some small portion of that gift to others who might need it. The forest continues to call to me, especially on nights when the wind sounds like whispers through pine branches and the city lights dim enough to reveal stars. But I know my path now leads through the human world, carrying the lessons I learned in the wilderness into places where they might do some good. I'm a bridge between worlds, a translator of experiences that exist beyond the boundaries of conventional understanding. And sometimes, in the quiet moments before dawn, when the veil between worlds grows thin, I swear I can still feel those ancient eyes watching over me, making sure I remember what I learned, making sure I don't forget the connection that binds all living things together in one vast, mysterious, beautiful web of existence. The Guardian is still there, still watching, still protecting the balance that keeps the world whole. And I am here, forever changed by our encounter, forever grateful for the gift of that impossible winter when I learned that we are never truly alone. that intelligence and compassion exist in forms beyond human imagination, and that the natural world is full of teachers waiting patiently for students ready to learn. That knowledge sustains me through the difficult days when the weight of human suffering seems overwhelming, when the destruction of natural habitats fills me with despair, when I wonder if we've lost our way so completely that redemption is impossible. In those moments, I remember the Guardian's patience, its willingness to see potential for good, even in a species that has done so much damage to the world it protects. I've begun teaching wilderness survival courses, not because I think everyone should live alone in the forest, but because I believe people need to understand their connection to the natural systems that sustain all life. During these courses, I watch city dwellers discover abilities they never knew they possessed, the capacity to read weather signs, to find food and shelter, to move quietly through wild spaces without disturbing the creatures that live there. Sometimes, if the group seems ready for it, I share carefully edited versions of my experience. I talk about the importance of remaining open to encounters with wildlife, of respecting the intelligence of non-human beings, of understanding that we share this planet with forms of consciousness we're only beginning to recognize. I never mention the Guardian directly, but I plant seeds that might bloom into greater understanding. The letters I receive from former students often mention transformative experiences they've had in nature after our courses, moments of connection, instances of feeling watched and protected by unseen presences, encounters with animals that seem to display unusual intelligence or compassion. Reading these accounts, I'm reminded that my winter in the forest wasn't unique in its potential for transformation, only in its specific circumstances. We all carry within us the capacity to recognize and honor the intelligence that permeates the natural world. We all have the ability to step outside the narrow confines of human-centered thinking and participate in the larger community of life that includes every living being on this planet. The Guardian taught me that wisdom isn't the exclusive province of humans, that protection comes in many forms, and that the barriers we imagine between ourselves and the rest of creation exist primarily in our own minds. These lessons have become the foundation of everything I do now, from the work I choose to the relationships I nurture to the simple daily practices that keep me connected to something larger than myself. As I close this account, I want to return to the moment that changed everything. That instant during the blizzard when I looked up through the swirling snow and saw something impossible moving toward me with purpose and compassion. In that moment, every assumption I'd held about the nature of intelligence, about what was possible in this world, about humanity's place in the larger web of existence, was forever altered. The Guardian of the Forest gave me more than protection from the storm. It gave me a glimpse into a way of being that honors the interconnectedness of all life, that sees cooperation rather than competition as the fundamental force that shapes our world, that understands patience and wisdom as virtues worth cultivating across the span of centuries rather than moments. I carry that gift with me every day, and I try to live in a way that honors what I learned during those transformative winter months. The forest continues its ancient cycles, the Guardian continues its patient watch, and I continue my work as a bridge between worlds, sharing what I can of the understanding that was so freely given to me. In the end, perhaps that's all any of us can do: receive the gifts that life offers with gratitude, learn what we can from teachers who come in unexpected forms, and pass along whatever wisdom we've gained to those who come after us. The Guardian of the Forest understood this fundamental truth, and in teaching it to me, ensured that its influence would extend far beyond the boundaries of its woodland domain. The connection endures, deeper than memory, stronger than doubt, as eternal as the ancient pines that continue to whisper secrets to anyone willing to listen.